Picture this: a young girl in blue gingham, ruby slippers sparkling, skipping down a yellow brick road toward a magical emerald city. For over a century, we've watched Dorothy's journey as pure fantasy, a charming escape into a world of talking lions, flying monkeys, and friendly witches. But what if I told you that Frank Baum, wasn't writing a children's fairy tale at all? What if every magical element in The Wizard of Oz was actually a documented piece of American industrial age horror? The Wizard of Oz isn't fantasy, it's journalism. Baum was documenting the economic collapse, political corruption, and social devastation that was systematically destroying American families in the 1890s. The yellow brick road wasn't a path to adventure. It was a trail of economic destruction that led millions of farmers to financial ruin. The Emerald City wasn't a magical destination. It was the illusion of prosperity that powerful elites used to distract from their manipulation of the American economy. Dorothy wasn't lost in a dream. She was trapped in the very real nightmare of Gilded Age America, where corrupt politicians made impossible promises, industrial accidents turned workers into literal machines, and an opium epidemic was putting entire communities to sleep while pharmaceutical companies profited from their addiction. Behind every piece of Oz magic lies a documented disaster, a real tragedy, or a historical injustice so brutal that Baum had to disguise it as fantasy to get anyone to pay attention. The man behind the curtain wasn't a fictional wizard. He was the very real political and economic elite who were pulling the strings of American society while hiding their true powerlessness to help the people they claimed to serve. You're about to discover that your favorite childhood movie has a body count, and the yellow brick road is paved with the economic bones of American farmers. Let's start with what everyone remembers. Dorothy stepping onto that gleaming yellow brick road, following it toward the promise of the Emerald City. But in 1893, when Baum was writing, there was nothing magical about gold for American farmers. It was killing them. The yellow brick road represents the gold standard, the economic policy that was systematically destroying rural America. Under the gold standard, the value of money was tied directly to gold reserves, creating deflation. Money became more valuable, but also more scarce. For farmers, this was catastrophic. Imagine borrowing 0 to buy your farm when wheat was selling for a bushel. Under deflation, wheat prices dropped to 50 cents a bushel. Now, you needed to sell 2 bushels to pay the same debt. Between 1870 and 1890, over 11 farms in Kansas alone were foreclosed. Entire families lost everything: their homes, their land, their livestock, their future. Suicide rates among farmers skyrocketed. The Kansas State Board of Agriculture documented case after case of farmers who couldn't bear watching their children go hungry while bankers in distant cities got rich from their suffering. This is why Dorothy's shoes were originally silver in Baum's book, not ruby like in the movie. Silver represented the populist solution to the gold standard, bimetallism, using both gold and silver to back currency. This would have increased the money supply, caused inflation, and made farmers' debts manageable again. Dorothy's silver shoes on the Golden Road wasn't just imagery, it was economic policy disguised as fantasy. The Emerald City represents the illusion of prosperity that the financial elite created to distract from their manipulation. Everyone in the Emerald City had to wear green-tinted glasses. making everything appear more valuable than it actually was. This wasn't subtle metaphor. It was direct commentary on how financial institutions were literally creating the illusion of economic health while systematically extracting wealth from working Americans. The Panic of 1893 had just devastated the country when Baum was writing. Over 500 banks failed. Unemployment hit 20%. Railroad companies collapsed, taking millions of jobs with them. But in major cities, the wealthy continued to live in unprecedented luxury, building massive mansions, while families in rural areas literally starved. Baum had witnessed this firsthand. He'd run a general store in South Dakota during the worst of the agricultural depression. He'd seen families lose everything, watched children go hungry, witnessed entire communities destroyed by economic policies that benefited distant financial centers at the expense of working people. The wizard himself represents this distant financial elite, the powerful men in New York and Washington who controlled currency and credit but had never worked a farm, never built anything with their hands, never faced the consequences of their decisions. They seemed omnipotent from a distance, but when you got close enough to look behind the curtain, they were revealed as ordinary men with no real power to help the people they claimed to serve. The Tin Woodman is one of the most beloved characters in Oz, but his origin story reveals one of the darkest aspects of American industrialization. He tells Dorothy that he was once a real man, a lumberjack who fell in love with a servant girl. But the wicked witch enchanted his axe, causing it to cut off parts of his body piece by piece until he had to replace them all with tin, losing his heart in the process. This wasn't fantasy, it was documentary. Industrial accidents in the 1890s were so common and so brutal that workers joked grimly about being turned into machines piece by piece. The Bureau of Labor Statistics from this period documents thousands of cases of workers losing limbs, eyes, and lives to industrial machinery that had no safety protections. In steel mills, workers regularly lost fingers, hands, and arms to rolling machinery. Mine workers developed black lung, so severe they couldn't breathe without mechanical assistance. Railroad workers lost so many limbs to coupling accidents that artificial limbs became a booming industry. The Tin Woodman's story of gradual replacement wasn't metaphor, it was the literal experience of American industrial workers. But the most horrifying detail is the loss of heart. Industrial work wasn't just physically destroying workers, it was dehumanizing them. Factory managers timed workers' movements to the second, treating human beings like components in a machine. Workers who had been craftsmen, who took pride in their skill and artistry, were reduced to performing the same motion thousands of times per day. They became machines. The scarecrow's lack of brains represents displaced agricultural workers who were told by industrial society that their knowledge was worthless. Farmers who understood weather patterns, soil conditions, plant biology, and animal husbandry were dismissed as ignorant by urban industrialists who had never grown anything in their lives. As mechanization eliminated agricultural jobs, millions of rural workers were forced into factories where their agricultural knowledge was not just useless, it was actively mocked. The Cowardly Lion represents the political leaders who knew what was happening but lacked the courage to challenge the industrial system. William Jennings Bryan, the populist candidate who ran for president 3 times, was brilliant, passionate, and absolutely terrified of taking on the full power of industrial capitalism. He gave speeches about the cross of gold, but never had the courage to implement the radical changes necessary to save working families. These weren't cute character quirks, they were devastating social critiques. Baum was documenting how industrialization was systematically destroying everything that made humans human: their bodies, their minds, their hearts, and their courage. The oil that keeps the Tin Woodman's joints moving represents the constant medical attention that industrial workers needed just to keep functioning. Patent medicine companies made fortunes selling pain relief to workers whose bodies were being destroyed by industrial labor. Laudanum, cocaine-based tonics, and alcohol consumption skyrocketed among industrial workers who needed constant medication just to get through each workday. One of the most terrifying scenes in the movie shows Dorothy and her friends falling asleep in a field of beautiful poppies, overcome by their narcotic fragrance. This wasn't magical fantasy. It was Baum's direct commentary on America's devastating opium epidemic that was destroying families across the country. The 1890s were the peak of America's first opioid crisis. After the Civil War, millions of soldiers had become addicted to morphine used for battlefield medicine. But the problem exploded when pharmaceutical companies began aggressively marketing opium-based medicines as cure-alls for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Patent medicines like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained massive doses of morphine and were marketed specifically to mothers for calming fussy babies. Laudanum was sold in grocery stores alongside flour and sugar. Bayer marketed heroin as a cough suppressant that was safer than aspirin. These weren't street drugs. They were legal medicines pushed by respectable companies onto unsuspecting families. The statistics were horrifying. By 1895, an estimated 200 Americans were addicted to opiates. This in a country with a total population of only 76 million. The addiction rate was higher than at the peak of America's recent opioid crisis. Entire communities were being destroyed by what they thought was medicine. The poppy field scene captures exactly how this epidemic worked. The characters don't choose to take drugs. They're simply walking through what appears to be a beautiful, harmless environment when they're suddenly overcome by forces beyond their control. This was the experience of thousands of American families who trusted their doctors and pharmacists only to find themselves trapped in addiction. Dorothy herself doesn't fall asleep because she's protected by the witch's kiss, representing the few people who had enough information to avoid the pharmaceutical trap. But her companions, representing different segments of American society, all succumb because they lack this protection. The rescue comes from outside forces, Glinda's snow and the field mice, representing how communities had to save each other because the medical and pharmaceutical establishments that had created the problem couldn't be trusted to solve it. Temperance movements, women's organizations, and community groups became the primary forces fighting addiction because official medicine was still pushing the same drugs that were destroying lives. The poppy field scene was Baum's way of showing that addiction wasn't about personal weakness. It was about being exposed to forces that were designed to be irresistible. The pharmaceutical companies had created products that were specifically engineered to create dependency, then blamed their victims for lacking moral character. The most famous moment in The Wizard of Oz comes when Dorothy pulls back the curtain to reveal that the great and powerful wizard is just an ordinary man operating an elaborate deception. But this wasn't just a plot twist. It was Baum's direct attack on the political corruption of the Gilded Age. When powerful politicians made impossible promises to desperate constituents, while hiding their complete inability to deliver real solutions. The wizard's promises to Dorothy's companions mirror exactly the kind of political rhetoric that was being used to manipulate American voters. He promises the Scarecrow intelligence, the Tin Woodman a heart, and the Lion courage, but these aren't things he can actually provide. He can only give symbols, a diploma, a testimonial, and a medal. This was a direct commentary on how politicians were handling the economic crisis. They offered degrees and certificates while people needed jobs. They gave speeches about American values while families lost their homes. They handed out medals and honors while workers died in industrial accidents. The wizard's greatest deception is his claim to be from Kansas, just like Dorothy. He tells her he arrived in Oz the same way she did, swept up by forces beyond his control. But unlike Dorothy, he chose to use people's faith in magic to gain power over them, instead of trying to help them find real solutions. This represents how many politicians of the era were actually from working-class backgrounds but had abandoned their principles once they gained power. Grover Cleveland, president during the worst of the economic crisis, was born into poverty but became a champion of the gold standard that was destroying farmers. William McKinley, who defeated Bryan in the 1896 election, grew up in a working-class family but became the candidate of big business. The wizard's hot air balloon represents how politicians escape consequences when their promises fail. When the economic policies don't work, when the industrial accidents keep happening, when the communities keep dying, the politicians simply float away to new positions where they can start the same cycle of deception again. But the most radical element of Baum's story isn't the wizard's powerlessness, it's Dorothy's power. Her ruby slippers had the ability to take her home all along. She didn't need the wizard, didn't need to complete his impossible tasks, didn't need to earn his approval. The power to solve her problems was literally under her feet the entire time. This was pure populist politics. The solutions to America's problems weren't going to come from distant political leaders or wealthy industrialists. Working people already had everything they needed to solve their own problems. They just needed to recognize their own power and use it. The ruby slippers represent the collective power of ordinary Americans. When farmers, workers, and communities organize together, they can create change that no individual politician or businessman can stop. But like Dorothy, they've been convinced that they need permission or help from authority figures who are actually powerless to help them. Dorothy's click of the heels 3 times represents the democratic process, the repeated collective action necessary to create political change. There's no place like home isn't nostalgia. It's a political statement about the value of local community over distant power centers. The real tragedy of Oz isn't that the wizard was a fraud. It's that Dorothy spent the entire story believing she needed his help when she already had everything necessary to save herself. This was Baum's message to American voters. Stop looking for saviors among the powerful and start recognizing the power you already have. The man behind the curtain wasn't hiding his villainy, he was hiding his irrelevance. The real power was never in the Emerald City. It was always in the farmhouse, in the community, in the hands of ordinary people who just needed to click their heels together and believe in their own strength.